second part of Revelation that we are discussing tonight is one that brings out its spirituality. We all live in a society that is becoming more bewildering and more violent and is dehumanizing much of our experiences. So the quest for a humane society is really what faith is about, I think, especially in this context. So the focus is on the humane, and I will take you to Revelation 18, where this is most prominent. Revelation 17 to 18 are the two chapters about the harlot, or the whore, the woman prostitute who is a compatriot, so to speak, of the dragon and the two beasts. You have an evil triad, and together with the woman, they form the epitome of evil. So if you go to Revelation 18, you will see that it follows on 17, where a wonderful description is given of this woman. She's extremely attractive. Everyone desires her. And it's really a beautiful portrayal of desire and that which brings it forth. The woman is a fantastic symbol. It's fascinating that the evil triad, that's the dragon and the two beasts, are in focus in these chapters, but they need a woman to come to completion. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So 17 gives us this wonderful description, and then in 18, it's the irony that this woman who dominates the political scene and whose power is felt so strongly that she's judged. What is inspiring to the whole world, all the nations desire to follow her, be with her. She is destroyed as the epitome of evil. And then you find in chapter 18 from verse 9, the whole chapter is beautiful, but if you read from verse 9, you see, let's read a few verses. And the kings of the earth, all the important people, who committed fornication and were wanton with her, I'm reading from the Revised Standard Version, the older one, they will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. She's being judged. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, thou great city, thou mighty city Babylon, in 1 hour has thy judgment come. And then the very nice following verses, 11. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys the cargo anymore. Cargo of gold. Now you have a wonderful list of the wealth of the Roman Empire, the first century empire. The cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple, silk and scarlet, all kinds of scented wood, all articles of ivory, all articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, all fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses and chariots. It's almost like Somerset Mall. And then at the end, this wonderful addition, and slaves, that is human souls. And that's the climax of that passage. This woman, with all her wealth and privileges, is being judged because it's built on the labor of slaves. It's built on oppression, on extortion, and lack of freedom of human beings. It's not a humane society. They go for the luxuries over the bodies of the poor and the unfree.
Sorry, Prof, what is the reference for that? What verse is that?
That is verse 13 at the end. And slaves, that is human souls. So that's just introduction. If you, the next slide, must I, shall I? Okay. So, this is contribution of revelation and biblical spirituality to the struggle against violence. Because 12 to 18 is all about violence, as I will. Now, these chapters form the body of Revelation. There are two books. Book 1 is, you've done it up to now, is chapter 1 to 9. And then in 10 to 11, as I will show you now, you have the introduction. That's where the little scroll is given to the prophet. And then look at the, yeah, I'll just add this one. Introduction in book 2, the little scroll, that's chapter 10, almost in the middle of the book. So you have two books. The scroll in 1 to 9, and then you have a second book. The first one is opened in the throne vision, and then revealed in the septet of letters, in the septet of seals and trumpets that you did. So you have a book 1, introduction, then you have a septet of letters, septet is, of course, letters, 7 letters to the 7 churches, and then the throne vision in 1 to 3. And then after that you have the seals and trumpets. It's a very patterned book, very carefully composed. And this is mirrored in book 2. Look at that. There's also introduction. He's given the prophet is given the little scroll. It's bitter and sweet. And then there is a heavenly scenario, or introductory scenario, throne vision, and then the 2 witnesses who are taken up in heaven after being persecuted. And then in the following chapter 11, you have the fall of Satan. So this, if you have to understand Revelation always in terms of pairs. You have a good Trinity, and you have a evil Trinity. There's the evil dragon and the 2 beasts, and the evil woman. This contrasts with the heavenly woman in chapter 11, and the Trinity, and the 2 beasts are refer to Christ. He has a mark, he's marked, but the mark heals, and that reminds you of the crucifixion. And the second beast is the prophet. He's prophetic. And there you have, at the beginning of 1 to 3, you have the 7 prophets, the 7 spirits. They are those who speak in the name of the Holy Spirit. So you see duplication. The second beast, in other words, the evil trinity mimics the divine. You have the dragon, which is God. Then you have the first beast, which is Christ. And you have the second beast, who is the prophet. Some people say the Holy Spirit. Others say no, you must think more, in a more general sense, about the prophets, like John. He's one of the prophetic characters in the early church. Why is this important? Evil does not exist in its own right. It is always a deformation of the divine. So you find in evil, if God brings salvation, evil brings destruction. So John thinks in a binary way, good and evil, those who are sealed and those who are not sealed, and so on and so on. And you see the evil in the dragon and the two beasts. So the focus of book 2 is on extreme evil. The dragon, evil has many faces. It's not as simple as bad and good. Contrasting, there's a dragon, there's a beast, there's a second beast, there's a woman. And they operate in various contexts. So, I just want to go back to that one slide. So, why is it important to keep in mind the binary nature of Revelation, things in black and white, in terms of good and evil? He wants, and he guides his readers. He's a prophet. And to be a prophet means you unmask. You make known what is unknown. You reveal what is hidden. So he tells his readers, on the surface, this is what you see. A woman who everyone desires, who's powerful. You see the state that is the dragon. It has all the authority and power. And you see its co-workers, the beast, and the religious institutions and the state institutions. You see them all. And I want to guide you to see how they obfuscate. They may be powerful. You may be enticed by them to join them or to compromise with them. That's the problem in the book. How far can you go along with them? So I want to reveal the true state of affairs to you in order, and there you have several functions of the book, because you have 7 churches, and every church has its own challenges, and everyone has to find a message in this true state of affairs for his or her particular context. So evil is a complicated state of affairs. It's not just a simple thing, a moralizing thing or economic thing. They are all bound together in a configuration of characters and institutions and people, which is, of course, tells you that the journey of faith is not an easy one. Faith, to believe, is to be constantly challenged to discern. Discernment is a true spiritual exercise in the life of the church. You have to be constantly awake to discover the true state of affairs so that you are not deceived into doing what is actually destructive to your faith. So this informs you, it strengthens you, it encourages you to persevere. Do not give up. Forms you not to compromise. It strengthens you not to give up. And I just want to taste this. So, now, so the focus is on evil, the dragon, and the woman with the 2 beasts, and they're constantly present, and they're extremely dangerous, extremely violent. But it's very interesting that as Revelation 12 develops into chapter 19, that those long chapters about all the threatening things that happen to the church, that there are the moments of relief, the moments of respite, the moments of where you travel through the desert and you come to the oasis. And it's just a short glimpse. It's not easy to get there. You have it in Revelation 7. We have the 144,000. They are in a heavenly context, praising God. They're celebrating their faith because they've been persevering, they've been following the Lamb. And you have it, as if, think of the pairs. He uses a Jewish image of the 144,000, that's the 12 tribes multiplied by 12. And then you have the multitude. Millions of people. That's in 7, only in 7 and 8. There you have that moment of, is this what waits for us if we persevere? If we sit through the septet of seals and the septet of trumpets with all its dark moments, its dangerous moments. Now we're in the oasis. Just a short glimpse into the glory of being a follower of God. And this happens in the second book as well, in chapter 14. You have 2 septets, the septets of bowls. That's the third. Many see only 3 septets, but there are 4 in the body of the book. And then the second septet of angels in chapter 14 is also that oasis, that moment of relief, that moment of glorifying God, of celebrating the faith and experiencing the presence of God. And of course, you will come to that later on. Remember, Revelation is not a linear book, it's a spiral book. You move from the septet of seals, a quarter of the earth is affected, septet of trumpets, a third, and then in the septet of bowls, the whole earth is judged. So there's constant growth. It becomes evil is no stupid opponent. It knows that it has to intensify itself to retain its effect of destroying people's faith. So, but the spiral effect is also in terms of the oasis. Finally, in Revelation 21, and this is the climax of the book, everyone enters paradise, those who are faithful. And there it's a wonderful garden. It's a garden where there are trees and fruit. Think of the luxuries of the Roman Empire with all its luxuries and privileges. No. Here you have the restoration of the earth, and Revelation is so important for ecology. Think of the earth as God's gift, as God's creation. Because finally, ultimately, the real moment of truth is when we enter into the new heaven and new earth. So there's this wonderful spiral effect. And this is so interesting because if you have the dragon and the 2 beasts at the beginning of 12 to 19, and the woman only after them, you would think the woman would come first and then the dragon and the 2 beasts. No, they are there first, they are very destructive, and then comes this woman, and she's very deceptive. She's just a woman, but she's extremely powerful. And then in terms of contrast, what is so fascinating about Revelation is the woman is judged first. She's removed first. And then the 2 beasts are removed. And then the dragon is slain at the end. So you have this wonderful antithesis. We call it a ring composition. You know, the thing forms a spiral structure. So this is then, you can see a wonderful narrative that serves a very specific function, and that is to guide people in their spiritual journey, which is a dangerous journey. It's not an easy journey, it's very challenging. But there are these moments of glory, moments of, I can breathe again and gather new courage for what waits, for the intensification of evil, because I know, this book tells me, evil will become more intense and more dangerous. So, this is only a few of the functions. God is present, that's a recurring theme in Revelation, a recurring theme. And that's the most basic thing the book wants to say. You may think God is not present because you are being persecuted and your faith is being challenged. I want to reassure you that God remains present. And that's the deepest meaning of faith, is to live in the presence of the divine and to find the courage and the strength to persevere and to in order to worship the God, the divine. So God is present, therefore remain witnesses despite the evil attack in Revelation 11. God is faithful. That's very important, that's very Jewish, that's very Old Testament. The covenant of God is being preserved here. God is faithful. Persevere, don't give up. And then, as I said, it's an ecological book. God is creator. This is very prominent in the book of Revelation. He creates what is ultimately destiny of humanity, and that is paradise, to be truly happy. And if you read 20 to 21, you will see how prominent, it always strikes me when I read those two chapters, how prominent the motif is of being in the divine presence. That's all. That's what really matters. And that's the true state of affairs. But this is more or less what I want to put in as a framework of what I now want to do, and that is talk a bit about evil as violence. Because I think that is one of the most challenging themes that the church faces today. Not because violence of war is facing us, but because there are so many subtle forms of violence in our society that dehumanize us. So that's what I want to do, but depends if you have remarks. You want to?
You tell.
Say again?
Please tell.
Okay. So why this focus on violence? I think because the church and the faith communities have been realizing in the last few decades that violence is a serious threat to the existence of the church. You remember the devastation of the Second World War and the role the church played in it, and the effect that had on with the World Council of Churches as a response to that, the desperation of churches to clarify why could this happen and why were Christians supporting it. The nuclear age, are we destroying the world? And then you find, as a result, the peace movements. One of them in Spain, if you go in the subway of Barcelona, these are Spaniards, but they have written every phrase of John Lennon's Imagine on the passage beams in the passages of the subway or the underground or the metro. And you know the Spaniards are big on peace. They have these huge marches. So there's this understanding of we need peace. We need peace. Violence is destroying us. And then, of course, the whole terrorist movement, and what makes this so devastating is that it is being it's being sought in terms of religion. You know, the ISIS people want to go to paradise. They share it with Christians, the Hebrews, Jewish heritage, paradise, and they are the virgins. You get how many, 40 or 20? I don't know whether our paradise. So terrorism, it's really worrying that religion plays a major role, or the most definitive role. Now, violence permeates the physical, of course, war and so on, the psychological, the emotional, intellectual. There's so much violence in the intellectual world, and etc. So there's economic violence, political violence, language violence, many. Race, gender, faith, physical, and the idea is it denies the other person its dignity, their dignity. And then cultural violence, and so on. So just to make you aware of how I see violence as a very complicated phenomenon. For a long time, we have seen violence basically associated with war, physical violence. But nowadays, we realize it's a very comprehensive phenomenon. Now, the irony, just a short remark, we always think of victims of violence as those who are being violently attacked or oppressed. But it's fascinating that recently we have seen many scholars writing about the effect of violence on the one who perpetrates violence. You know, post-traumatic stress syndrome among soldiers, bullies in schools who drop out and become social misfits. Ultimately, it has an effect on a long-term relationship of many people. Beautiful story that I always like to tell. You know, Malisi Mpulwani, he's now the chair of the South African Council of Churches. When he was in prison during the apartheid era, Archbishop Tutu visited him and said to him, "Why are you not bitter against the wardens, the prison wardens?" He said, because he told Tutu, "I'm praying for them every day." And his answer was a classical one, I think, when he said, "I pray for them that they regain their humanity, which they have lost in what they are doing to others." So there's violence. You can be a prison warden in charge with authority, and you can be dehumanizing. So I'm going to skip through it very briefly, just to say there are very wonderful indications of how the church in recent decades have come to wonderful things going on. Reflect on violence as the real basic threat of our society and as the most important factor that contributes to the dehumanizing of our times. I want to get to, and this happens especially in academic studies. I tell you, there are hundreds of publications coming out on violence in religion, and many of them on violence in the Bible and biblical text. So let me just, and the biblical scholars would focus on the role of the Bible in violence. Think of the Psalms, say 137 verse 8, "Happy shall be they who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take you, your little ones, and dash them against their rocks." It's fascinating to see how a phrase like that is being incorporated in hymn books and in reflections. This is extremely violent. What do we do with those texts? I want to get to, there's awful examples in Numbers. You know, the nations who are killed with the Exodus and so on. In the New Testament, Mark 13, everyone will be judged and thrown into darkness and so on. There's a very violent language, extreme violence. And then we get to Revelation in our chapter 17, 16, the woman. This is where evil, the beasts, turn against the woman. The beast will hate the war. They will make her desolate and naked, They will devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. Not nice to read. I would love to hear your response to it. It's not only, yes.
Sorry, you asked me for a response, may I?
Yes, sure.
What would you say to somebody who said, this book is something I struggle with so much? I've just read in the previous chapter about 1/3 of the human race being destroyed. And you're giving us a litany of dreadful, dreadful things. And I'm a Christian, I'm trying to live my Christian life in a violent world in a peaceful and humane way. It's not helping me. Except it's saying, right, that's the worst there can be. I'm saying, I know that well and good, but I don't feel like I want to take this book to bed with me at night. And it matters to me what I take it.
Yes, for sure. I have a few slides that I gave George to show you of the most beautiful paintings inspired by the book of Revelation. Revelation is the source of the most exquisite art in the history of mankind, of course, humankind. And I'll give you, if we have time, I'll give you a few examples. So it's a book that inspires. That's so strange, you know. It's a book that repels in the sense that you refer to. But immediately you have to contrast that and say, why does it inspire artists to make such beautiful works of art? Let me take that answer. I'll skip the other examples. For example, the idea of why must the epitome of evil be a woman, a prostitute? Yes. I'll try and answer your question in a few minutes because I have spelled it out his thought.
History. But we take this is in English, and we take English literally. But the Bible wasn't written in English. It was written in Greek and Hebrew and Latin. And all the words have more than one meaning. So to fixate on women being evil or anything goes wrong, it's the woman's fault. She should know better. Maybe because of the apple. But you're talking one painting. There's a painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's Abelard and Eloise, and they had forbidden love, for which they paid for. But in this painting, they are reunited, and there's all the apples of creation in the painting.
So in the midst of persecution and violence, they survive.
They survive. In the end, there's love. If you believe there is an afterlife, there is a coming together. I mean, we all, the saints, and we just had all the saints there. If you believe that,
yes.
If
I may take that a bit further in terms of what Revelation writes out in the narrative, I would say, being in the presence of each other, they are strengthened. They can face the violence. I just want to pick up Revelation language here and do what I think is the most important thing of spirituality. You're outside yourself. You're not self-absorbed. You're not, as Luther said, curved into yourself. You live for the other, and that is so liberating. And then to live for the other in terms of the divine, in that which is the deepest meaning of everything, that makes you persevere. And of course, and that's the meaning of love. But I think we will pick that up too, because what you say about some language, how do we handle this issue? And I have the following guidelines which I worked out for myself. You can't ignore this. You can't say, but it's just language, you know. It's just occasional if you take them out. They are really disturbing. And you know how it goes if you meet someone and that person says just that one wrong thing that makes you feel very uncomfortable. It can destroy a whole experience. And it's like you read this book and suddenly you see this very hard language. And if you're sensitive, or if you don't know how to cope with it, you struggle. So, and this happens if you go to the lectionary of the church. Revelation is the one book that is ignored. You know, people, which says what? It's telling that it's ignored because people know it's difficult, but they had no explanation for it. They could not handle it. So do not underplay. You can't say it's mere language. And then the other thing is, you won't believe this, but Revelation is quoted by many people. Alan Musa, Desmond Tutu, are wonderful examples of having recognized the heart of Revelation as a non-violent book. You witness, you don't fight back. You speak the word. And of Christ, the word, the sword, is not in his hand, it comes from his mouth. That's a very powerful non-violent image. Can you imagine how the first readers had to conceptualize that? Came from his mouth. But they knew it means it's a tough, prophetic word that addresses the problem of evil in order to purify and to help people avoid it. So don't underplay this as if it's just language. You know, people say, I find this very difficult because if you are consistent, you hear all these swear words on. My mother always said, my mother was someone who never swore, never. She would walk in the street and if someone would say, oh God, she would literally turn back and say, don't do that. You know, she became upset. We say it's old-fashioned, it's just words. I don't think so, because it reveals a bit of darkness in your soul. So, these don't underplay it, or downplay it. Understand the power of language. It's fascinating to watch the American election events, where, you know, a single sentence can be lifted out and said, look, this is unwanted for. This can destroy a political campaign. There's something, I have an example of Hillary Clinton. She spoke about despicables. I don't know whether you remember that the supporters of Trump were despicables. People really honed in on that and blamed her for that. And it shows you have to be sensitive. And the problem is that if you have violent passages, and this happened consistently from century to century, that people who perpetrated violence appealed to Revelation. They said, look, this is what happened to sinners. Now, they must be burned, they must be destroyed. This was the thing in the Crusades as well. Now, how do you respond to that? You respond, a guideline is, how do you handle this, is to say, I want to watch my language. I want to affirm women in church offices. And so on and so on. These are, I want to make people conscious of violence and so on. There are many things you can do, but you have to structure it. You have to structure the fight against violence. You can't just make it an intuitive thing that happens. And this is what is happening in the church. The World Council of Churches has a permanent office where they study violence. They have the most wonderful studies on violence, how congregations and churches parishes meet and make specific attempts to study violence in terms of their context. And this is institutionalizing action against violence. Now, in terms of revelation, of course, and George already told you this, you have to understand revelation in terms of its context. Violent passages in the Bible does not mean that the Bible promotes violence. I think that's very important. Some passages are violent. That's an important distinction to make. But if you say that, you can at the same time say there are passages in the Bible that are clearly anti-violent. So, of course, the challenge is, what way is heavier? I mean, love your enemies. What is more radical than that? It's a complete rejection of violence, and that's the golden heart of Jesus' ministry. So, this is relativizing. You have the violent remarks, hate. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? In Deuteronomy. In Psalm. And then in Matthew 5:43, love your enemies. So that's what way is heavier. And then, so you have to read it in times of its origin. You have those awful ethnic cleansing texts in the Old Testament, where many people are simply killed because they belong to a nation that occupies the land that the people are entering. And you can say, well, this does not happen in the New Testament. That's a counter-argument. When we were in Makanda, in Grahamstown, the Anglican Church had an issue with the plaques in the church that commemorated the soldiers who died in the Kaffir Wars. And they were really struggling with, do you have that in a place of worship? So what they did was to add comments to say, this is typically of language used previously and we do not agree with it. So they're adding comments to show your distance to violence. That's a guideline. And then distinguish between what the text says and what people do with the text. Because what people do with the text does not mean that the text really says it. And then if you have the violence, you also have in the Old Testament wonderful examples of hospitality, of being kind towards strangers, and that's a recurring golden motif in the Old Testament, which is in in the whole culture of the Mediterranean today. You all know they are very hospitable. You are invited and you become part of the family and so on. So, what is the situation of Revelation? To understand those texts, remember, it's a very violent situation. Violence was something normal in that time. Antipas is killed, some are in prison, beasts persecute and kill many, and then the harlot is drunk with the blood of the holy ones. This is violence against the church. How do you if you are the recipient of that type of actions, it is to be expected that you may use the same language, even though we today find it offensive. You see, Revelation does focus a lot on Christ being slain and the severe threat under which Christians live. Now this is not only true of their context, but also in terms of their traditions. The Old Testament as for example, the language of holy war, and in the spiritual journey of Christians are expressed in terms of that holy war tradition. Now then, unavoidably, you incorporate violent language, although you may frame it in a non-violent manner. Now, this is the real heart of the book of Revelation. This is why I focus on it. What is the main thrust of the book? And I think, to me, the most convincing interpretation of Revelation is that it's a book about witness. Witness. The two witnesses. And from the beginning, Revelation 1:1 is, I proclaim to you what was given to me in Revelation 1:1-3. Witness. There's an openness in this book towards the nations. Revelation 14 is a wonderful book. And that's the last septet, Revelation, the septet of bowl. No, this is septet of angel, second last. There's a beautiful passage in Revelation 14 where the mighty angel appears and with a gospel to proclaim to those on earth, every nation and tongue and people, and call on them to fear God, give him glory, and so on. Beautiful. This is witness. And that's in the septet of bowls, focuses on that. So it's in the heart of the book. I've already spoke of Christ, the portrayal of Christ, word coming from, the sword coming from his word, mouth. And then the issue is not the language so much as what is being done with the language. So this is in conclusion now. Despite everything we say to explain why this language was taken up and used in the book, it remains an issue. It's not trying to condone it in any way. We have to read it spiritually. If you read this book spiritually, it can be extremely powerful. Now here again, you know Bonhoeffer, he was imprisoned because he wanted to plant a bomb. He was planning violent actions against the state. What was his most favorite book? The Psalms and Revelation. That's what he read in prison. He writes it in his own words, his wonderful book where he describes his letters from prison. And Tutu and Busa, what is his book's name? Alan's book. No, Lord for your what? Comfort.
Lord for your comfort.
Lord for your comfort.
That's Trevor Huddleston.
Yeah, that's Trevor Huddleston. Yes, that's an important book. But Busa also wrote a commentary on Revelation that became internationally praised by many scholars on Revelation. Protest and comfort, what's the thing? I can't remember. It's a very important commentary. So violence will only disappear if we address these root causes, and that is the breakdown of relationships. Realize that we need each other. We have to regard each other as human beings. And that's the economic perspective in Revelation 18 that's often ignored. You have all these luxuries, but in that process you walk over other human beings. So the root cause is economics. And Alan Busak is the one who brought this to the attention of the scholarly world, that there's this important economic perspective in Revelation. That's economic violence. And then pure education. It's a book that informs. Revelation informs. It tells people what is underlying the surface of their existence. So, on a still deeper level, Violence is when the orientation to God is disturbed. And that is often the result of an inner brokenness, where you do not have self-violence, where you do not recognize that you are the creative being, that you are the object of the divine, the most important divine action, and that is creation. So you have to understand that we are not willing to become the mature self that we are called to be by the Creator God. We have to oppose fanaticism. That's so important, and this is a warning. You must remember that Revelation is not a book about violence only in the world of the Roman opponents. It's a book about violence in the church itself. There's a split between Jews and Christians, and they persecute each other. Jezebel in the church, and her role in the letter to Pergamum. So, we have to understand what happens within religion, and then all this happens, as we now discover, when we have a good, honest discussion about violence. We can't downplay it in any way. We have to acknowledge the role of religion. But I want to come to my very last remark. This is the religious one. We have to understand our common humanity, discover the neighbor, and the importance of koinonia, community. And you have to understand that discovering our common humanity is replicating what God is doing. It's in the character of God that He reaches out to humanity. There it is, the one that I really want to stress. Again, I already mentioned it. Seek to be in the presence of God. This is true religion, to be in the presence of God. You can have an understanding of common humanity, which is good, positive, and spiritually inspiring, but all that rests on being in the presence of God. The problem with the harlot in Revelation is 19 is that she thinks she's God. That is said in Revelation that she thinks herself greater as God. This is just a few. Look at this, the famous picture of John on Patmos. Beautiful colors. There's the angel that appears there. This is said to be the scene from the island itself. Beautiful colors, and this is also paradise, Adam and Eve and so on, beautiful. I'm showing you a few art pieces. Sword from the mouth, shows you how impossible it is to depict that as art painting, but the idea is correct. Except that it should really come out of the mouth. 7 candles. And the book. And this is a famous painting by Dürer. The sword, the Bible, and here is John. And look at he's prostrating himself before God, praying. There are the 7 candles. It's wonderful to see an artistic explanation of it. Look at the depth that he creates by putting some of the candles in front of the others. So you have this mystical thing of your eye is guided to the divine, completely mystical. And then there's another Patmos. This is, what's his name? I forgot his famous, so typical. This is the English William Blake. William Blake, he made wonderful pictures of Revelation. That's the one there is the mighty angel. Stands on the land and the sea. Look at that. It's beautiful. That's what I mean by inspiring, people who were inspired by the book. This is Salvatore Dali. Yeah. Also mystical, this wonderful lightness of being. That's an African one. That's dearer again. Look at that. George, look at that. Death.
Oh.
Pale horse.
Say again?
The pale horse.
Yeah.
Mm.
White horse. That's Blake again. That's it.